As Brandon mentioned earlier, I'm on the environmental services team here at the district, and one of my primary roles is to manage vegetation establishment of projects typically 3 to 5 years post-construction. And today I'm going to talk about how things have been going at the Cherry Creek Restoration Project, which is a large capital improvement project located along Cherry Creek between Iliff Ave and Quebec Street in Denver. Here's a side-by-side comparison pre and post project. And as you can see, prior to the improvements, there was a heavily incised and degraded channel that was disconnected from the floodplain. Project goals focused at creating a stable channel and reconnecting the floodplain through a series of small grade control structures that would resist future channel incision. Channel banks and overbanks were graded to minimize erosion once vegetated. This approach relied heavily on vegetation, the establishment of which is critical for project success. However, this approach comes with risks. First off, the project area is downstream from the Cherry Creek Reservoir, which annually flushes the reservoir with volumes that mimic a 5- and 10-year event, respectively, every other year. Next, the Cherry Creek corridor has very sandy soils, which makes it difficult to retain water and facilitate vegetation establishment and growth. And lastly, there was some uncertainty about the design floodplain elevation due to a lack of a suitable reference within the project area. As I mentioned, vegetation was a key component of the design, with the expectation that once established, it would prevent erosion, particularly during the annual reservoir releases. The site was planned to support 4 distinct vegetation communities: irrigated uplands, a non-irrigated floodplain bench designed for riparian vegetation and comprised of mesic and flood-tolerant species, fringe wetlands along the channel, and habitat depressions, which were designed to develop as wetlands and are lowered about 1 foot on the floodplain bench. Similar to a lot of our larger projects where construction spans multiple years, the initial vegetation installation was completed in 2 phases, with the upstream 1/3 being completed in late fall 2020, and the downstream being completed in late 2021. 2021 was the first growing season for the upstream phase. We turned on irrigation in the uplands, and we had a pretty wet year. If you look closely at the September 2021 aerial imagery, the upstream phase 1 has started to green up, and the downstream phase is still in active construction. With vegetation installation completed at 2 different years, we have the opportunity to compare how precipitation during the first growing season influenced vegetation establishment over the following 3 years post-construction, and explore the adaptive management strategies implemented on-site in response. And we can do this because rainfall in the first growing season was remarkably different for each phase. Mile High Flood District has a rain gauge located nearby the project site with long-term data collection. I will be showing these precipitation graphs for the first 3 growing seasons for each phase. In these graphs, the blue line represents average rainfall data from the past 20 years as a point of reference. The green bars are annual rainfall for phase 1, and the yellow bars are annual rainfall for phase 2. And as you can see, the data shows that for the first growing season, phase 1 in green had above average precipitation, and phase 2 in yellow was in substantial drought compared to the 20-year average. To take a close look at how precipitation affected vegetation establishment for the first 3 growing seasons, I'm going to highlight a reference area for each phase, as shown here. Phase 1 is always going to be highlighted in green, and phase 2 is always going to be highlighted in yellow. And here's a zoomed-in look at the aerial imagery for each reference area for the first growing season. Phase 1 on the left, phase 2 on the right. I've classified vegetation into 3 different categories based on visual observations of vegetation cover, with dark green as high vegetation cover, light green as moderate vegetation cover, and brown as sparse or bare areas. What's noteworthy here is that in phase 1, with above average precipitation for the first growing season, there's a lot less of that brown or sparsely vegetated areas, whereas phase 2, in substantial drought for the first growing season, has a lot of brown or sparsely vegetated areas. Moving forward, we'll want to pay close attention to the brown in each of these reference areas. And if I add on the vegetation community labels, we see that most of the brown in both phases is located on the non-irrigated floodplain bench. The wetland fringe came in very nicely the first year for both phases, as did the habitat depressions, which, as a reminder, are just 1 foot lower on the floodplain bench. And of course, the irrigated uplands were coming in well after the first growing season too. Here are some photos of what vegetation cover looked like on the ground for the first growing season. These are from phase 1, which experienced, again, that wet growing season. Vegetation looks as expected. And here's phase 2, the fringe wetlands and irrigated uplands, both of which experienced drought during the first growing season, but look pretty good overall. But in phase 2, the non-irrigated floodplain bench struggled. Notice the amount of bare ground and exposed soil in these photos. Moving on to the second growing season, we have the opposite precipitation amounts for each of the phases, with phase 1, again in green, with substantial drought, and in stark contrast, phase 2, in yellow, had the wettest year on site since construction, with over 6.5 inches more rain compared to the 20-year average. When we look at the aerial imagery of our reference areas, we see that phase 1, even with substantial drought, has seen an increase in vegetation cover overall by the expansion of the dark green and a reduction in the brown or the sparsely vegetated areas. In contrast, phase 2, with that exceptionally wet year, still has a lot of brown or sparse vegetation cover, and most of that is located on the non-irrigated floodplain bench. And here are some photos for the second growing season. This is phase 1, which again was in drought. We can see pretty lush vegetation in each of our vegetation communities, although it is somewhat brown due to the drought. And here's phase 2, which had the very wet year. We can see the vegetation is very tall and very green from all of the rainfall, especially in the fringe wetlands and irrigated uplands. And this is what the floodplain bench looked like in phase 2. Again, we have very tall green vegetation due to all the rain, but if we look beyond the vegetation or below it, we still see quite a bit of bare area exposed. Going into the third growing season, phase 1 experienced that really wet year, and phase 2 received pretty average rainfall overall compared to the 20-year average. And here's how our reference areas looked for that third growing season. Notice that in phase 1, with that exceptionally wet year, no longer has any sparse areas on the floodplain bench. It is fully greened up. But phase 2 still has some lingering. There's continued reduction of the brown, but it's still there. And if we look at some photos for the third growing season, again, this is phase 1, wet year, very green, lush vegetation, very tall. Phase 2, our fringe wetlands and our irrigated uplands, still looking very good for average rainfall. But the floodplain bench is still struggling in phase 2. All things considered, you might be thinking the site has vegetated more or less as to be expected over these growing seasons, and I would generally agree. But one thing I haven't mentioned is how the annual flushes from the reservoir have affected the site, which I'll discuss now. Starting in 2022, the annual flush occurred in early June, and this is what it looked like on the ground. Floodwater has spilled out of the channel and onto the floodplain bench. The project area is functioning as designed. But as the floodwater receded, our channel banks, which had those fringe wetlands that vegetated really well, held up great. However, with lots of bare area on the floodplain bench, we had 4 areas of overbank erosion, which I've highlighted here in pink. Most of these were repaired in 2022. Because we had so much rainfall in 2023, the reservoir didn't actually have an annual flush. In fact, the reservoir was the highest it had ever been in its 75-year history. Instead, they released a constant high water level for a majority of the growing season. And even without the flush, we had a similar outcome to 2022. As the high water receded from the site, some of the bare areas on the floodplain bench experienced that overbank erosion, again highlighted in pink. And we had a bank actually fail and blow out and dump some sediment into an adjacent outfall. This was repaired in 2023. And lastly, we saw another flush in late May 2024. And I'm sure you've already guessed that once again, we experienced overbank erosion on the floodplain bench because of the lack of vegetation cover. What I haven't mentioned yet is that all of the erosion on the site occurred in the downstream phase 2 part of the project, where the first season was marked by substantial drought. Most of the erosion that did occur was confined to the overbanks, while the fringe wetlands and the habitat depressions remained largely intact. In contrast, the upstream, or phase 1 portion, which received sufficient precipitation in the first growing season, required no erosional repairs whatsoever. There are a few noteworthy takeaways regarding vegetation establishment during the first 3 growing seasons at Cherry Creek. First, early water availability is critical. Natural precipitation in this region is unreliable. Inadequate irrigation in the first growing season can set a site on a successful long-term trajectory. This could be said for any project looking to grow and establish vegetation. Next, design and planning for both short and long-term conditions is key. The project generally functioned as intended during the reservoir releases, indicating that it will likely function well long-term once vegetation has fully established. However, small design tweaks, such as slightly lowering the floodplain bench, planting more deep-rooted, fast-growing species that stabilize soils, such as willows, and/or prioritizing irrigation on the floodplain bench could have improved vegetation establishment to better withstand the short-term site vulnerabilities. It's worth mentioning one more time that those habitat depressions vegetated very well naturally, and again, were only 1 foot lower on the floodplain bench. Additionally, most of the willows that were installed during construction survived and held soil in place. These are the kinds of insights that ecological experts typically bring to project teams. And lastly, a more proactive adaptive management approach could have reduced some short-term risks. Aside from the erosional repairs, the only other adaptive management on the floodplain bench was weed control. Proactive strategies like installing a temporary irrigation system, planting more fast-growing species like those willows, or doing some additional reseeding in areas that continued to be bare could have minimized the erosional repair needs. And with that, I'd like to give a shout out to the folks who have worked on the site since construction has wrapped up: Corvus Environmental Consulting, Habitat Management, Western States Reclamation, Baez Construction, and Muller Engineering Company. And a big thank you for being a great audience, or at least for being a quiet one, which I will choose to interpret as interest in this content. Thank you so much.